All right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first of the Pan Allen Energy Limited series. My name is Kurefa Allen Peregba. I'm the managing partner of Pan Allen Energy Limited. First of all, we apologize for starting a bit late. It's 9:08 a.m. here in Nigeria, at least, and we are going to kick off with a formal introduction. I'm sure most of us must have been seeing some of our ads on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. But Pan Allen Energy itself, it's a boutique energy consulting firm, and we offer basically 4 services. 1, training, analytics, research, and advisory. And a couple of services that comes under this core 4 services we render. It's energy, sustainable energy consulting, provides financial advisory services, data analytics, negotiation support, among many others. And our culture here is to ensure that we deliver exceptional service to our clients, those that are willing or that are choosing to do business with us. So that's that. And now, today we're going to be talking about understanding fuel subsidy through the lens of data. As a consulting outfit, one of our core responsibility is to provide advisory services to government and decision makers. Lately, the issue of subsidy removal has been a hot topic in the Nigerian space, and today we want to use this opportunity to lend our voice into that topic. And I would like to introduce our guest speaker. His name is Dr. Festus Adedoyin. Excuse me if if I did not get the name right. But he's a fellow of the Higher Education Academy, a senior lecturer and program leader for BSc Business Computing with Analytics and BSc Data Science and Artificial Intelligence at Department of Computing and Informatics, Bournemouth University, UK. His current research interest is in the application of artificial intelligence, machine learning, and deep learning, econometric tools, research theories in energy and tourism economics, as well as finance and digital health. Dr. Festus Adedoyin has contributed to several thematic areas in United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and is open to international research and collaboration. His achievements are quite many. Because of time, I will not be able to, specifically tell you what awards and others he has attained. But I think at this point, it is right for me to introduce Doc. Doc, over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Alan, for that warm introduction. Just to check, I believe you can all hear me and you can see my screen. Today, we are having this webinar to explore policy making in Nigeria, but also policy making in terms of the recent fuel subsidy, but also trying to understand tools that are available to explore policy making in developing country context, but also globally. These are strategies that can be used by policymakers to set up effective policies that influence lives and also influences economies of the world. I will start by first looking at the issue, taking an economic um, exploration of the issue. Before we then go into the tools that are available, there are current tools that are being used, approaches for making policies that affect lives. But then we would look at the aspect of data. You know, when you have data, when you have tools like data science tools, when you have artificial intelligence tools that are very useful, how can those influence policies? How can those be used to establish policies, to monitor the effectiveness of those policies and make changes where necessary? Um, we would start, this is just a few content um, to, this is just a few contents to guide us in our conversation today. First of all, we will look at the um, energy sector in Nigeria. We look at the subsidy debate as well. Then we try to talk about effective public policy making using the case of fuel subsidy removal. And then we would also look at data science, artificial intelligence tools, minor, major tools that can be used within the public sector. This will be the bane of our conversation this morning, and I would start now by talking about the issue, and then we'll move on to the tools that are available. And to start us off, um, just to have a generic overview of Nigeria's energy sector, and the energy sector in Nigeria is quite dynamic in its operation, having several stakeholders who come together to um, make sure that the market continues to run and services are provided, products are available at reasonable prices. And we know that these stakeholders sometimes they manage different kind of energy types or energy sources. And one of those is, you know, the oil and gas. And we know about the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation, which is the body that looks after the oil and gas sector. Um, and then we also have electricity generation as part of the energy industry in Nigeria. We have the transmission of electricity, the distribution of electricity as well. Of course, we have the generation of it as well. But we're not going into these organizations and their roles and functions, but we will be looking at who they are and their availability, their presence within the energy sector in Nigeria. And of course, for transmission, we have the Transmission Company of Nigeria, which is in the TCN, who looks after transmitting electricity. But we also have the distribution companies, which are the DISCOs. Again, these bodies we're looking at gives us the background. By the time we start talking about the tools for effective policy, public policy making, we will be able to accommodate some of these bodies to see their dynamic operation and how data science can be useful to make sense of the of public policy making. We also have the Renewable Energy Master Plan, which Nigeria has to make sure again we are able to contribute to clean energy sources, the REMP. We also have regulatory frameworks. So these are those in charge of regulations, laws, policies, plans that will work together to make sure that services are available and stakeholders are monitored and taken care of appropriately. One is the Nigerian Electricity Regulatory Commission, NERC. We also have the Department of Petroleum Resources. Again, I'm going through all these bodies deliberately, as I mentioned earlier, so that we can understand the complexity within the sector and why we really need to think carefully more about more automated tools, more advanced tools in a more serious approach to look into public policy making for this sector in the context of Nigeria being the most populous country in Africa, and of course the largest Black African nation in the world. And so it's important to have that perspective when we look at all of these agencies. We have the Department for Petroleum Resources, DPR, also in charge of, part of the regulatory framework. And then we have rural electrification, all of these operate the REA, Rural Electrification Agency. And finally, we talk about energy efficiency. And of course, there are programs, all kinds of programs principles, policies, regulations, laws guiding the operation of stakeholders within the sector. Um, so we have this agencies, these setups, having the need to work together, and any policy made has a wide spectrum of impact when we look at considering all of this diversity within the framework. Now, um, let me move on to look at the subsidy debate. Now, we will do a bit of theoretical discussion just to properly contextualize the subsidy debate. I'm just going to quickly make sure this is properly uh, positioned. I think one of my graphs is missing. Okay, that's fine. So let us look at the subsidy debate in a bit more context. Now, the subsidy debate tells us of the economics of it, looks at consumer surplus, the purpose of subsidy. So we start from the purpose. Why? Why should we bring in fuel subsidy? What is the point when the government subsidizes? Not necessarily fuel, it could be agriculture, education, um, all kinds of things can be subsidized. So overall, when we talk about subsidies in general, the aim is to increase consumer surplus, the benefits that accrue to consumers. And if you look at the standard demand analysis, which tells us of the demand and the supply, and of course you have demand, those who require the product, supply, those who make the products available. You see the standard. So if we just take a minute to look at the SP, so I'm talking about this particular SP and the DP, so the demand and the supply, initial here at PE at equilibrium. We're all happy, we're all fine, producers are happy, consumers are happy. Just at this point here, we see the volume and we see the price here, and we know that CS1, which is our original position, is the consumer surplus. Now, if the government subsidize an intervention occurs, the government now decides to subsidize this product. What happens is that the price, so the subsidy makes more supply available, which pushes our supply curve outward. And now we see S1 and S1P moving outward that way. From SP, we move to S1P. And that just tells us that what happens to the price is it drops. So the PE was the initial price, the equilibrium price. The PS is the drop in price, which tells you that now it's more affordable. We can buy more because now the prices are low. And if you look at the quantity on the horizontal axis right here, it makes people happy to buy more because now the price is cheaper because of the subsidy, the intervention. And what happens is the whole of this place from CS1, where we were in terms of consumer surplus, expands a lot more to take hold of CS2. So the whole of this triangle here, all the way from CS1 to CS2, becomes the surplus that is available to consumers. Now, this is a very beautiful analysis theoretically, and of course, the demand theory and supply theory, market analysis helps us to have an idea, to conceptualize the market and government intervention in the market, being able to expand consumer surplus, all beautiful, all nice, all amazing. The challenge, however, is that when you decide to have this subsidy in place, you want to make sure that you increase the quantity supplied. Now, this is where it's a bit tricky. If you decide to have the intervention, add the subsidy, the theory says supply will expand because people want to buy more now that the price has reduced. So that's really nice. However, the condition is that the supply must increase to match the pressure that will be on demand. So this is the goal. This is where you want to be. You want to be able to make sure that suppliers are there to make these products available. Again, as I said earlier, this is not just about fuel. This can be about education. It can be subsidized agriculture. The theory, the framework of analysis remains the same. Now, if you look at my last bullet point here, the goal is to make sure that supply is expanded um, to enhance that welfare. And this can be what we have theoretically been experiencing in the case of Nigeria. So over the years, the debate on fuel subsidy has been a lot. Has been so many economists, so many statisticians talking, policymakers, politicians, legal practitioners from the law side, the social side, the politics side, and all of these, and the economic side of things, arguing about fuel subsidy. Now, if you remove that subsidy, we just need to reverse. I haven't created that graph just for the sake of time, but we just need to reverse the analysis I've just made. So imagine that S1P, that graph on the right, this one here, is not there. So we go back. So if you take out the S1, we assume this is where we are now. This is where Nigeria is in terms of subsidy. Now, reverse the scenario to say the price is on PS, subsidy price, PS, reverse the case. When you remove the subsidy, you have to reverse the analysis theoretically again. You reverse the analysis, supply, the subsidy price now goes back to equilibrium. So the price goes up. What happens to quantity? It reduces, and it leads to a lot of hardship and complexities within the economy. So this is the issue. This is the theoretical underpinning. Before we then go to talk about how data science and AI tools, all of the new developments we have all over the world, and the capabilities of technology, the intelligence of technology, and all of these amazing tools, how can it then be useful to make very good policies within the energy sector, not just for Nigeria, but anywhere else in the world? Now, let's move on to see some of the implications here. If we look at extended considerations, just to extend the analysis a little bit and discuss more, the decrease in supply, it raises price. So this is when you remove subsidy. You remove the subsidy, we go back to the initial scenario. So you decrease supply, you reduce welfare. Of course, practically, people are experiencing a lot reduction in welfare and capabilities, and the abilities to enjoy and buy, products, and salaries are a bit more choked because of the pressure on prices and so on and so forth. All of this reduces welfare. And this has happened significantly. Historically speaking, when we talk about first subsidy removal and returning subsidies and all of this, it has been the issue a lot with kerosene and aviation fuel on both extremes. So if you cook with kerosene, you can't afford to pay gas, and you use kerosene for stoves and all of that, you see an immediate impact on the low income bracket. On the high income bracket, people who fly either for buying their products or for business purposes, there's a lot more increase in the price as well. So these are the impact, the visible element of a reduction in welfare when you remove subsidy. Now we move on to look at the effectiveness. So what if subsidy were to be effective? Now again, on this webinar, I am not taking any side. We're just looking at the theory and the tools that can help us make very effective policy. So I'm not taking any side to say, this is the best way to go or that. But of course, let's look at the issues here. If subsidy were to be effective, the goal will be that firms will be encouraged to invest more. That is in a perfect system. Companies invest more, and because now they spend less on import or on refining because the government subsidizes, and so part of their own expenses is covered by the government through a program called subsidy. And potentially such investments, of course, will boost employment, will get more jobs, either in downstream, upstream, sectors, and so on and so forth. So employment is affected, productivity is affected, potentially competitiveness of that country is also influenced. And income is affected in terms of the national gross domestic product, and finally economic growth. The economic growth. This is the ideal scenario when first subsidy is effective in terms of its operation. But there are also possibilities where you have cases of corruption or potential inefficiencies, where there are loopholes explored within that policy. Maybe numbers are inflated, and so on and so forth. There are also costs we must mention in this webinar. There are also costs which we call opportunity costs. And what we are saying here is that within the opportunity costs, if you take money from the national budget to take care of fuel subsidy, what you're doing is you're taking that money away from somewhere else. It could be from health, it could be from education, it could be from agriculture, but definitely money spent on subsidizing fuel or any other thing is taken out from a different way it could also go. And so there's that, potential opportunity costs. But also there are benefits in terms of market liberalization. So you open up the market, as it may have been the case for foreign exchange in Nigeria at the moment. When you liberalize the market, you make it more competitive. You make private sector to compete, and so on and so forth. But also social implications. So, for example, some people argue that you don't want to remove fuel subsidy close to an election. Why? Because the hardship is real. It's short term, potentially, if everything goes as planned, as we will see in the next few slides. But there are social implications, immediate hardship, huge pressure on income, which makes expenses to be a lot more higher. And of course, salary and income doesn't usually catch up with expenses, as it were. So inflation grows, at a rapid rate, and so on and so forth. So these are some extended considerations to the issue of fuel subsidy. We have looked at what it means, how it's supposed to work theoretically, and but also looked at the implications, both on the positive side and on the negative side. Now we make progress to talk about effective public policy making. Now we're not saying this is the best way to go or that is the best way to go, and so on and so forth. We're saying that there are some current approaches when public policymakers make policies. Um, in some case, there are some research, maybe some data analysis that goes into trying to understand the numbers and so on and so forth. There are policy analysis, sometimes maybe lessons from other countries where it have worked, maybe Singapore or South Korea, or the US, the UK, Canada, and so on and so forth. You may, take lessons from, other places where it's worked. There may be stakeholder engagements. That could be also another way. You bring stakeholders together at the round table. We discuss the implications and so on and so forth. There might be policy briefs, memos going around to highlight the impact, but it can also be policy modeling and simulation, which is where I'm going to go in a minute. That's the focus of our webinar, the other aspect of our webinar. And of course, monitoring policies, evaluating policies, communicating policies, and advocacy. Now, these tools they work together, but of course, in some cases, some government prefer to work with some specific approaches to policy making, and others have a more holistic approach to say, well, we have done this policy, we need to communicate the implication of these policies, we need to advocate for support for these policies as well. There's also technology and data management overall, and then policy learning, knowledge exchange. I remember in South Korea, there's this Korean Development Institute where you have, a lot of, knowledge exchange, exchanging knowledge, what works well, what doesn't work well, and sharing those knowledge to other countries to learn about all kinds of issues in the economy. But I would focus more on three connected bits in terms of tools for effective public policy making. Research and data analysis, that's great. Public policy modeling and simulation, that's very good as well. And also technology and data management. All of these three seem to fall within the sphere of data science and AI. And that will be where we can we would settle in a little bit. Now, let us look at public policy in modeling and simulation. This is a really important tool that can be used. Public policy modeling and policy simulation looks at having a computational model. Now, initially, I talked about the theory. So the economic theory, the base theory, upon which the issue of fuel subsidy, upon which it operates. So that economic model is on one hand great, but the modeling of policy is also important. So this is where you take data. It could be historical data. This is where you interact with data to try to simulate or to create scenarios to see potential impact even before a policy is made. So it's I always advocate that you don't separate the economic model, which is the base upon which the theory, the thinking of all policies are based on, but also the data collection of or the testing of those models or the simulation of potential scenarios. They both work hand in hand. It's very important to combine both. And so policy modeling and simulation emphasizes having computational models or having simulations that can be used to predict outcomes when you have different kinds of scenarios. And simulating policy scenarios helps policymakers to understand the impact, the risks, in fact trade-offs. We talked about opportunity cost earlier, which says if you take money away, if you put money in fuel subsidy, you're actually taking money away from maybe health or other sectors. And so understanding trade-offs and when those trade-offs are beneficial and when they are not beneficial or need to be delayed. So simulation has capabilities to come up with scenarios. In some of my papers, I think I have about 3 or 4 papers where I conduct simulation experiments. One has been conducted for Japan, one has been conducted for Germany, one has been conducted for South Africa as well, just to understand if we make a policy, if we simulate a policy, a scenario, and we say in 2050 this is where we want to be as a nation, how impactful can we get there, and by how far can we get there? So there are tools, machine learning based tools, dynamic autoregressive distributed lag model tools that can be used. And this is a very strong aspect of what I want to advocate for Nigeria in this webinar. There are several types of model. In some cases, some have social models, some have environmental models, some have economic models that can be tested and simulated. In my experience, I have used economic models for simulation and experimentation. There are inputs and assumptions, yes, that has to be made. You have to make assumptions. So you have to assume, for example, there will be stability in terms of exchange rate, for example, or there wouldn't be any war, outbreak of war, or you have to make assumptions. You have to keep some things static, and then you have to run your dynamic model and make predictions based on that. But then we also have scenario building, so where you create a scenario and then you test the potential impact of those scenarios. There are simulations and predictions. One thing about simulation is it can predict. So if we remove subsidy in 2023 May, and we assume that by 2030, in 7 years, the energy sector will be highly self-reliant, would have made this level of contribution to the economy, consumer surplus would have been restored, inflation. So we make all of these assumptions. We can actually predict. Again, some simulations, there are all kinds of simulations that can be done, but some simulation uses historical data. Some simulation creates synthetic data to have an idea. And based on all of these assumptions, the good news is you could always reiterate these simulations. You could always change variables. You could always assume numbers in terms of the percentages you want to arrive at, in terms of the time period, and so on and so forth. You could also add more lags. You could have lag variables and so on and so. There's a lot of things that can be done for impact. This may have been done for the fuel subsidy scenario. However, as we mentioned earlier, the communication of policy, the advocacy of policy needs to be a bit more clear for this to be understood. But also we have sensitivity analysis, which can be done. We have decision support. We have iterative process. All of these fall under policy modeling and simulation that can be used to understand the impacts of policies. I will move on to the next major aspect now where we are, which is in terms of data science and artificial intelligence. Of course, you may already know there's a lot of information around about the usefulness, the benefits of data science and AI tools. And data science, just to explain what that means. It combines statistics, mathematics, computer science, the domain knowledge as well, which is very important, to extract knowledge, to try to see what are the insights that we can get from the data. And that data can be structured data, it can be unstructured data, and that's the realm of data science. It's a very important aspect. I like that it doesn't ignore the domain. So we'll get to the application of into different sectors in a minute. But it's good that there's a very good knowledge of the domain where you're talking about when you apply data science tools. But you also have artificial intelligence. These sort of develop intelligence systems that can perform all kinds of tasks. These can inform public policy making, and there are all kinds of aspects. There's the machine learning, there's natural language processing, there's computer vision, there's robotics, there's expert systems. All of these, we're not going to be looking at specific tools or exploring specific tools, but we're saying that there are opportunities here to be able to understand public policy and make those public policy based on the benefits that we get from these tools. In terms of application, this can be applied to healthcare, finance, or kind of issues within these areas, marketing and customer analytics, manufacturing and supply chain, transportation and logistics, energy and the environment, and so on and so forth. One thing that is very evident in terms of energy and environment is in terms of potential impact. So one example is when we look at the climate change goals. We know about the COP, the Conference of the Parties, 26, 27, and all of this conversation has been about setting carbon emission goals. Some countries would say, by 2050, we want to phase out the use of coal energy completely. Some countries might say, well, by 2050, we want to be able to achieve, a 2% target on these, on that, all kinds of policies in place. And the question is, how effective will these policies be? Are there evidence of simulated processes or the use of advanced analytics tools that informs those policies? So we don't get to 2050 and then realize, oh, we didn't capture assumptions, or some of our inputs and assumptions are wrong. And so we're not on the right trajectory to achieve this goal. These are some of the applications, areas of applications in terms of practice, where nations have made effort to set up goals. And to move on, I want to give enough time for reactions from the audience. It will be good to get feedback, as this is a webinar. It will be good to really get feedback from the audience. So overall, data science and AI tools are very effective. They're very effective tools in terms of subsidy policies. It will help policy makers to make very informed decisions. Again, I'm not saying governments haven't made informed decisions in the past. I'm saying that with the use of these technologies, if communicated properly, it can demonstrate to the public that yes, proper care has been taken, and very good tools that has worked in several cases have been applied, have been employed before these decisions are made. We have run scenarios, we've run multiple iterations, we've modeled policies, we've taken lessons from successful nations, and so on and so forth. Before we arrive at this decision, we can confidently say that 90%, we can say that we're confident that up to 90% that this will be achieved. We will get to the goal in the end. And this gives that and this is published, so the processes can be seen and people can understand. These tools, again, back to our discussion, can help identify target beneficiaries. This is one thing that is very like a gray area when we talk about fuel subsidies, because there are multiple stakeholders, particularly Nigeria's energy sector, and of course any energy sector in the world has multiple stakeholders. Again, we have sectors within downstream, within upstream, but we also have different aspects of the fuel itself, of energy itself. And so who how to target beneficiaries of a policy. Is it the users? Is it the importers? Is it the companies? And so on and so forth. So we need to clarify. And how do we do that? We can do that using data science and AI tools. Split the stakeholders into different groups. Examine the impact of the policy on these different groups. Find out who has the most impact. Of course, there is a very you can't be biased towards consumers, the final users, households, families, citizens, general public. They will be at the end. They may not will be. They may be at the end of the stick in terms of the impact. And so you want to clearly identify who is most affected. What sub policies can we establish to cushion the effect of the impact? So these tools can help us understand this, and we'll get to some of those tools in a minute. And you also need to see that data science and AI tool is adopted in a way that you're optimizing your resource allocation. Back to the point where we're saying earlier, there's opportunity cost for every policy. So you take money, you invest money in first subsidies. A lot of that is money taken away from other sectors. And so you need to understand resource allocation. Should we carry on putting this much in fuel subsidy, or should we consider taking that money, liberating that market, take that money, put more in the health sector, and so on and so forth? So it's very vital to have these tools help us understand resource allocation as well. And finally, policy impact, which again is where simulation has very serious impact. It tells us that these policies needs to be evaluated. We need to test the impact of these policies. In terms of the use of data science and AI tools, considering particularly in this case for subsidy removal, there are some ideas that can help. Now, this my goal here in this webinar for those who are researchers or public policy makers listening or joining us today. My goal is to use these next few slides to explore ideas for research papers, from these conversations. So the goal is not again to say this is a bad policy, it's a good policy. No, the goal is to drive research, is to use these tools to open up ideas. What kind of research papers can we explore? Now that there's a new fresh policy, with advanced tools like this, what can we do to better understand this sector, to better understand this policy and its potential impact? This is the goal of these next few sessions. So please, if you're into research, or if you're a public policy specialist listening, joining us maybe now, or if you listen later, my goal going forward is to make sure that I provoke ideas from within you. I try to give ideas which you can take forward. And of course, you can always collaborate with Pan Allen Energy. They have a research team. You can always collaborate to work on research together. So let's dive in. One of the key is data-driven policy design. Now, policy design is very important. Now, it hasn't been tested in terms of its establishment or impact, but the design of policy is very important. When you're trying to design policies, you can use data science tools, especially in the area of predictive analytics and machine learning. Now, one of the key things before we start talking about this, in fact, the second thing I should mention now is data is at the heart of any data science and AI tool you want to influence, and that means we need a database. We need to have correct database. Now, data is very expensive. Some people say data is the new oil, but data collection, having a track record, 15 years of payments on fuel subsidy, 15 years of surplus collection or calculation, 15, 20, 25, 30, 40 years of data showing us the history of fuel and oil price, of inflation, of cost of living index. These massive data sets, even at household level, when we go to regions, there are 6 geopolitical zones in Nigeria. Look at the different regions. Where is it more heavy? Where is fuel most consumed? Is it high cities like Lagos, Port Harcourt, Abuja, Kano? where are the areas that are most influenced? So we need data. This is the core. We can't start talking about fancy tools without first actually providing the core, the basic foundation that will make these tools effective. And that is data. So I need to just spend a bit more time and re-emphasize that data is at the heart of any effective public policy making. Any use of data science and AI tools, you must have the inputs, and that has to be data. So we need to go back. Of course, we have our Nigerian Bureau, is it Nigerian Bureau of Statistics, NBS, or National Bureau of Statistics. And I'm sure that there are loads of surveys being conducted at household level. There are loads of um, statisticians, econometricians, mathematicians who have spent years and years collecting data. Those piles of data, kerosene consumption, aviation consumption, companies, new companies joining the industry, old companies. So that spectrum of data, that spectrum of a survey that tells us, that have been collected. We need to see those roll-on data. It could be a 5-year period data collected over every 5 years interval. It could be, a quarterly data available by the CBN on spending, disbursements, income. All of these data we need. And it needs to be made publicly available. I must appeal. Of course, I know how expensive data can be. But I think this is just an appeal that these data need to be made publicly available so users can download, especially for research. Of course, there are some you might need to buy and subscribe for, and so on and so forth. But it needs to be clear that this data is available. You can download this data. Of course, there are some data available with OPEC and the World Bank and IMF and maybe the Eurostat, maybe the African Development Bank. But the Nigerian Bureau of Statistics itself needs to make this data available. I know there's been a revamp of the website, and you can request for it as a researcher, and I think that would be a good thing to do. So now we've settled the fact that I'm trying to provoke research here, but I'm also trying to say data needs to be available. With those two conditions met, we can now start exploring the areas of research. What can we do? How can we contribute to the argument? We've talked about data-driven policy designs in terms of predictive analytics and the use of machine learning. If you have large data sets, we can look for patterns. We can look for patterns in terms of different oil types. We could look for patterns in terms of different socioeconomic status. All kinds of patterns can be looked for within a large, massive data set. If it's cleaned, correct, with very minimal level of error, that can inform um, you know, um, understanding of trends and so on and so forth. Who are the beneficiaries? All of these can inform public policy making. That's one arm. Policymakers can then design, subsidy policies that are very targeted, that are very efficient, and responds to the changing needs. One thing I found from my experience is that the world continues to evolve. So 10, 20 years ago, the structure of Nigeria's economy wasn't as this. I think some argue that Nigeria has the highest number of young people, young population, and so there has been a dynamic, there has been a shift in terms of focus, in terms of capabilities in Nigeria from 20 years ago. So if we say, oh, 20 years ago there was no fuel subsidy, we can't necessarily um, harmonize or equate a fresh policy to the history of the country. And so again, these are just ideas we can explore. They're not necessarily, I'm not necessarily finalizing or making comments on a policy. I'm just saying that it's important to understand that there has been transformation within the population, within the structure of the economy. What people are more interested in terms of economic activities, it continues to change. And as such, current policy trends or historical data can influence, with some assumptions, what the correct policy will be. So in terms of targeting eligible beneficiaries, again, when you make a policy, DSAI, again, when I say that data science and AI tools can actually help, either individuals or help the government to identify individuals or corporations or companies that are most affected. Um, and that could be split across demography, socioeconomic status. When you have correct data sets, well, then you can accurately target. In some context, when you remove first subsidy and you have learned from your data, the groups or the households or the regions that will be most impacted. In some cases, there are sub policies that could cushion, just be introduced to cushion the effects. It's not a biased policy, sub policy. It's just a policy to say, well, we know that the next 3 to 6 to 1 year to 2 years to 3 years, these will have severe impact on this particular group because they are at the lowest ebb of the income bracket. And as such, it might be some tax holiday, it could be anything. Again, it's just an idea, but the data tells you that this group in this region will be most affected. And if you can bring this sub policy to cushion the impact based on what the data tells you, then you are, socially, you're being responsible. And as such, again, back to our conversation, it just helps to explore that. But where is the research? We need to we need to find out, where are the publications that tells us all of this. They may be out there, but we need to document them. We need to have that bank of research on all kinds of issues, including subsidy. In terms of real-time monitoring and evaluation, this is also very important. Artificial intelligence-powered monitoring systems can track the impact. So it could be you create a sub-policy to cushion the effect of first subsidy removal. But the problem could then be that you need to track this sub-policy. Is it effective? Is there a leakage within the policy or the grant or whatever it's called? You need to track. So AI, you don't need. These are tools that if invested in, it's easy. It's cheaper than the long run. It's cheaper in the long run. You don't need to do much with the data there, with the systems established. It tracks. Also, it tracks and it can be monitored, and then you can further advise policy making. So this can help identify bottlenecks, inefficiencies, maybe corruption, maybe leakages, and so on and so forth. I need to move fast, so I can see lots of questions coming into the chat. So please keep your questions coming, so I could react to some of these questions and comments as well, please. Thank you. And again, in terms of the use of data science and AI tools, we also have, the fact that, you could detect fraud. You could also prevent. Again, there are arguments. We're not going into that. The politics of corruption. We're not saying, in some cases, some people argue that you can't exactly eradicate corruption 100%. However, I don't tend to agree, because you can have good structures in place. And again, AI systems provide that capability. As I mentioned earlier, you're not out there to hunt anyone, but you're actually out there to set up systems that will make leakage impossible. So with these systems, you understand the data, you understand potential areas where there can be leakages, you establish those policies within those areas, and it blocks those leakages over time. So AI tools can be put in place to monitor and track suspicious behavior, anomalies, or expectations. You could make a policy expecting it will be effective. If it's not effective, you could actually find out in time using these tools. And that can again make the government or authorities to sort of take early measures to mitigate these activities, or completely have a blockage for it. Resource optimization, we are back to the point I made earlier about first subsidy removal. As I've mentioned again over and over, I keep putting this disclaimer in this webinar. I am not saying that it's a good or bad policy. What I'm saying is that if you remove first subsidy, if you have first subsidy in place, as we know, theoretically, you're taking money away from other sectors. But with AI tools, there can be a form of resource optimization, where, if you analyze the data on demand, on supply, on market conditions, local market conditions, or global market conditions, that has capabilities to advise or to instruct the setup of policies in a way that resources are optimized. And so policymakers can utilize scenarios. What happens? What if there's a ditch in the price of crude oil, which has happened over time? What if there is a trough where the price of crude oil just goes down? What if there's a peak and then we're selling $200 per barrel? There's money. There has to be systems where you don't do anything. The system automatically allocates itself. So with these scenarios, with these assumptions, you construct very good AI systems that detects fraud, prevents it. Any peak or trough in the price of international price of crude oil automatically resolves itself. There's no expectation as regards, oh, now we have more money. No, the system works because it adjusts itself based on when we have more money or when we don't have more money. So it's just a system that needs to be in place and needs to be clear to everybody that yes, these systems are in place. And finally, I think this is my last slide before I start taking your questions. Um, the use of data science and AI tools, again, can help us utilize predictive analytics for the impact of a policy. So impact assessment, monitoring and evaluation is very important. We have done very well in Nigeria, in terms of policy, all kinds of policies. But in terms of its monitoring, its evaluation, um, we need to do a bit more. I believe very strongly that there have been several policy somersaults, sometimes abandoned policies, sometimes unwanted policies, because of lack of systems that can monitor the effectiveness of these policies. And so there can be potential analysis of the impact of a policy before it's implemented. You could also leverage on historical data. Now that it's been implemented, you could still conduct this research. So fine. In fact, this is the best time when we could actually start conducting this research. Myself, I might have a consideration soon to use these data science and AI tools to explore the impact. I think it's a good area of research I want to also go into myself, because the purpose is so you can explore. We have this policy, we have an administration that will be here for 4 years or for 8 years. But beyond this administration, if these policies this first subsidy removal were to carry on for the next 20 years, what will be the potential impact on economic growth, on foreign trade, on inflation, on cost of living, on well being, or social welfare? All of these are areas we can explore using predictive analytics. Um, and so that can inform. So the fact that the policy has been implemented means there's room for research, means there's room for contribution, utilizing these advanced tools. Again, feedback loops, continuous improvement. As I mentioned earlier, I know that yes, the subsidy has been removed, but what about continuous improvement? Now there are feedback in terms of impact. Who are the most vulnerable of the population that are most affected? That needs a bit of cushion, a bit of support within that money that has been removed. You could also bounce back in terms of cushioning the effect in the most affected areas of the population. So these are some contribution that I have in today's webinar. Apologies if I have gone beyond the 40 minutes I was allocated, but it would be good to look at questions and answers. Um, in terms of questions and answers, I think I have a few questions already. Thank you very much for your kind comments. Kizito Ekene, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for your comments as well. Razak Sanusi, this is a masterpiece from a master in the energy industry. Thank you. Well, I don't consider myself a master yet, but of course, we continue to do our best. As an energy consultant and based on the advantages and shortcomings of subsidy removal you have outlined, are you in support of the removal or not? This is a question from Razak Sanusi. This is a very tempting question. Am I in support of the removal or not? That's a good question. In terms of effectiveness, I'm not going to answer you yes or no, but I would say in terms of effectiveness, the expectation of the policy itself, first subsidy, when it was in place, wasn't felt. The purpose wasn't felt. Well, many people couldn't see the impact of the policy. As I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, if I just go back to this, the basic theoretical argument for having fuel subsidy in place. The basic argument is that the price should drop from the equilibrium price to a lower price. That will make people be able to afford and buy more, but that needs to be met by more supply. So the way the framework works is you have your initial equilibrium at PE and SP. You introduce subsidy to make, you know, to support the costs to producers. Say, okay, well, it costs you five naira. If I give you subsidy, I will take care of 3 naira. So you only have a cost of 2 naira. Oh, yay! I'm happy. I'm a producer. Thank you, government. I will be able to supply more. I was supplying just 10 barrel per day. Now I will supply 50 barrel per day because of your support. That's then, supply is available. The price goes down. People can buy more. This is the theory. This is the framework. This is the model. This is how it should work. But we haven't seen that in the first for years, really. And again, that just takes us back to some of the issues we've talked about. Corruption, inefficiency, and the social implications hasn't been great. And so one may tend to say, well, I think it's good to remove the policy, and then we see the impact. But how this is being done is what I think this webinar questions. Has it been done appropriately? Are there information about it? Are there research that shows that yes, this is really impactful? I'm sure there should be, but of course, maybe this hasn't been well communicated. There are thousands of research, maybe millions that have been conducted on fuel subsidy, but also any other subsidy, really, agriculture, education, anything that's been mining in the US, anything that's been subsidized, and so on and so forth. So thank you very much. I hope I've been able to answer that question, Razak Sanusi. So subsidy have been removed. Another question from you. Subsidy have been removed already. What policy do you think we can adopt, both in the short and long run, to increase supply, which will lead to decrease in prices, based on my analysis? Thank you very much, Razak. These are very brilliant questions. Yes, as I mentioned earlier, if we have, I'm just going to go to the slide uh, that talks about data science and AI tools. The truth is, if we have to remove subsidy, it's not a bad thing in itself. However, the data should have informed us of the most vulnerable of the population, the most vulnerable of the population who are mostly affected. There should be a sub policy, a very clear sub policy, of course, with its own analysis and all of that, which may have been selected from a chunk of policies that cushions the impact. There will be short-term impact, definitely. We all know that. But where is the additional policy that cushions the impact? Because this first subsidy removal has severe impact on different people across board. Of course, everybody's affected in different capabilities, but the point is there are some vulnerable members of the population who are most affected, maybe can't afford to live meet their basic needs. And so my argument is, we need a sub policy, and that could be a tax, a reduction, tax holiday, that could be some social welfare program. But again, as we know, some of these things don't work yet until we have very clear database and research that argues for the impact of all kinds of policies. So we need, of course, there are several policy think tank. I'm not claiming to be, know it all or anything. There's several policy think tank across board, all over Nigeria. And I do respect and acknowledge all their amazing research work being done. But I'm saying if this data is publicly available, researchers from all over the world can also contribute to make sure that we test the impact of several policies. I hope again that answers your questions, or at least I'm able to influence your thoughts a little bit with my response. Thank you, Razak. Emmanuel Eke, thank you. You have a question from YouTube. Okay, that's good. Thank you. Great presentation. Thank you, Emmanuel. Please, can you elaborate on available data and how to access these? Yes, I spoke extensively about availability of data. I know that the National Bureau of Statistics, NBS, with their head office in Abuja, I guess, have a lot of massive data. Now, when I say data, I'm not saying fuel subsidy data alone. I'm saying data, there are all kinds of levels of data. There are, survey data being collected on household level, maybe every year or every. It's expensive to collect data, really, but you can't make any effective policy without understanding, without collecting data, good quality data, clean, full of error, free of error kind of data. And so, if you check the MBS, there are some data being collected maybe by the World Bank or by the IMF and so on and so forth. But I just personally prefer to have data from the NBS, from the local body, who go house to house to collect data. How many children do you have? How many cars? And so all kinds of data, survey data that gives you, that geography of Nigerians across board, the northeast, the southwest, the 6 geopolitical zones. So we could download this data, combine those data. There are all kinds of research that do this already. Combine those data with subsidy data or market data or cost of living data, the cost of living surveys that has all kinds of features within the data. Clean the data a little bit, make more sense of this data to influence policies. I would go there to explore that a bit more, Emmanuel. I hope that helps. A few more questions here. Okay, good. Perhaps a clearer indication of available data will influence the crafting of actionable research goals. Absolutely. Absolutely. One thing that I do know, there are machine learning based models that I use. There is the dynamic autoregressive distributed lag model, dynamic ARDL. It's very useful for simulation. It's really good. It uses machine learning, but it's super, super effective. It can predict the impact of a policy. This is not just about fuel subsidy. It could also be about any kind of policy. So it uses historical data, learns from historical data, accommodates some assumptions, some inputs, and then make predictions based on those. It tells you what can potentially happen. And as I mentioned earlier, if you check some of my publications, I have used this dynamic ARDL machine learning model to make some predictions about Japan and South Africa and Germany as well. And it just tells you a lot about the options available to the government. For example, in my paper where I looked at renewable energy and non-renewable energy options for Japan. Japan is number one most complex economy in the world. And what I did in that, of course, with my colleague, what we did in that research was to try to understand what option is best. So option A, reduce consumption of coal energy, which is a dirty energy, or increase investments in renewables, wind, solar, and so on and so forth. Which is the best? From that research, we realized that both actually achieve the same goal. If you do either of those, you'll find yourself at the same point. But it informs you, it tells you, what is the best direction for the government to take. Okay, thank you very much. Razak Sanusi, you have a comment. Is the producer support not a subsidy on its own? Well, it is a form of support, but producer support needs to be clear. Exactly what do you mean by producer support? If you mean access to the sector, I think anybody have access to be a producer in any sector. However, if you're talking about extra government support, that could be, I don't know if this exists, but that could be in form of tax holiday. For example, if you want to go into renewable energy production in Nigeria, you get 5 years tax holiday. For example, I don't know if that exists, but for example, if that's what you mean by producer support, that is not subsidy. Subsidy is directed at reducing the costs for the producer, of course, but with the aim to increase supply. And that huge, massive pressure on supply, reduce availability of supply, reduces the pressure on demand and brings the price down. That's the idea. So that may be a bit different, but again, it could be also another kind of sub policy. Thank you. Ali Umar, you have a question. Thank you very much. What impact does the new monetary policy has on fuel subsidy removal? That's a very brilliant question. Monetary policy. So again, when you have these policies, when you have fuel subsidy policy or all kinds of policy, I always advocate a holistic view. So if I just move up to my slide where we looked at the issue extensively here, subsidy generally would have impact on, of course, all kinds of things, on investment, because it attracts investors. Say, for example, the government decides to subsidize education. Definitely, there will be people interested in making these services available. So it attracts investment, it attracts employment, it attracts productivity, income, and overall, the economic growth. Now, where monetary policy comes in is in all of these areas, not necessarily in a particular sector alone. So you have an intervention called fuel subsidy. Um, you have its impact on several aspects of the macroeconomy. And then you have your monetary policy, which then influences all of those impacted areas within the macroeconomy. So it's a very tricky question to ask, because monetary policy itself doesn't directly have an impact on fuel subsidy. However, because fuel subsidy has impact on several areas of the macroeconomy, the monetary policy itself influences those impacted areas of the macroeconomy. So that's the best way to think about it. And then, of course, you can begin to explore, what it means for investment, what it means for employment, and so on and so forth. I mean, the monetary policy itself. Again, I hope I have been able to answer that question. But again, these are all amazing questions. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much for asking these questions and for reacting to these questions. And I'm sure we look forward to having more of these kind of webinars in the future. And it will be good um, to have you join us again. If you want to request for these slides, we'll be happy to for you to send an email. You can send us a request if you want these slides. Again, my focus is to make sure you are provoked to conduct more research in this area. Of course, explore the data available, explore your capabilities in using machine learning tools and of course AI tools as it were, and then you can always conduct this kind of different research. Yes, Emmanuel, thank you very much for your comment. I am open to research. Absolutely. I'm very keen on the modeling aspect of things using data. But of course, feel free to send an email to info at panallenenergy.com. I will be happy to respond to that. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. And we look forward to hosting you again in the future. Thank you.